Let's come to Anne-Marie now. Working at the Lowy Institute, it's such a big topic, but what would you like to say when it comes to achieving sustainable economic development? I'll just throw that big ball question and say go.
Gosh, thank you. Thank you for throwing that huge ball. Listen, I'm going to disappoint a lot of you, if not all of you, by saying there isn't one answer. And I think this panel tonight represents and demonstrates so adequately the different approaches that you need to take when you're tackling sustainable development or trying to achieve poverty reduction. There isn't one answer, and the answer that might fit in a place like Samoa is going to be entirely different to the answer that might fit in Papua New Guinea. It is also going to be probably quite different to parts of Africa. And I mean, we all know that Africa is not just Africa. Africa is 48 mainland countries, all of which are quite different to each other in many ways, some remarkably more than others. So what works in South Africa is obviously not going to work in Egypt, to give an extreme, but I think you appreciate what I'm trying to say there. So there is no one answer, but what there is, and what is terribly important, is innovation and the power of a good idea. Harriet talking about fair trade, what a powerfully good idea has that been. Some of the fantastic ideas of the past decade. Let's just look at what was happening in London this week with Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunisation. What a powerful idea was that, to come together to find ways to actually convince pharmaceutical companies to start looking for cures for diseases that there isn't the money to pay for in the developing world. If it was a disease in the developed world, there might be the money, but not in the developing world. So this idea to come together and bring resources so that you can actually support and push the pharmaceuticals into actually finding cures for really important and significant developing country diseases. Another fantastic idea came out of the Clinton Foundation. Using his power, Bill Clinton was able to start to push and to amalgamate the strength of market forces to bring down so significantly the cost of antiretrovirals for people suffering from HIV, to the point now that, I don't know if you saw The Economist last week, but it's the best good news story I've seen on AIDS for a good decade, and I've been working in the area of HIV and AIDS for some time. What powerfully good ideas are those? But the other thing you've got to have the right policy settings. You can have good ideas, but if you're going to get a closed door, if you're going to get a situation where governments aren't listening to you, if governments actually put into place policies which are going to work against that good idea, then you're going to be struggling. One of the most depressing pieces of news I've read in a long time, actually, I read it tonight, just before coming in here. I was sitting upstairs in the library, filling in time, reading Vanity Fair. And there was an article, the latest article by Joseph Stiglitz, who, as you all know, is one of the world's most interesting and important economists. He was looking at the situation in the States at the moment and doing a comparison with who owns what, and revisiting his own PhD thesis. And he came to the conclusion that 1% of America's wealthiest own 40% of America's wealth. You think that's significant? 25 years ago, it was 12% of America's wealthiest owned 33% of America's wealth. So while you have an increasing concentration of America's wealth in its richest, you are finding that the rest of the population is actually diminishing in terms of their own wealth. And the gap between the rich and the poor in the United States is far greater than the gap between the rich and the poor in Europe. Now, I just mention this because it tells you something about policy settings. It tells you something about getting the right framework in the respective countries to ensure that when that good idea comes along, when that coffee farmer has the brilliant thought about how to actually improve her or his prospects, if you don't have the right policy settings, you can find that whatever good idea you have isn't going to work. And I just want to finish up on, don't want to depress you, I now want to cheer up a bit and urge you all to remember that while you have to have those policy settings, you really need to be listening to communities. They're the ones who live wherever they live. They understand where they live. They know what they want to do, and it's usually not just for themselves, it's for their children and their cousins' children and their neighbours' children. I do a lot of work with Indigenous people in the Arctic, and I tell you, I've learnt a tremendous amount from them in terms of their enormous respect for the environment. They recognise that to prosper, they have to have economic development, but they are constantly looking for ways in which that economic development, which will bring prosperity to them and their communities, can happen at the same time as protecting as best they can the environment upon which the Inuit have survived for thousands of years by protecting that environment.